President, I want to thank my colleagues from Washington, from Connecticut, for being here and for speaking out and for being so remarkable in their persistence in defending America's concerns about health care. I want to add my voice for just a few moments, if I might. Let me look back 8 years to when I first joined the Senate in 2010, and at that point, the Affordable Care Act was just barely a year old. Since then, in the early years of the Affordable Care Act, we saw some very positive patterns. More Americans gained access to health insurance, health care cost growth slowed, insurance markets put in place under the ACA proved to be resilient despite repeated challenges. And as a result of the ACA, 20 million more Americans, including 38,000 Delawareans, gained access to high-quality, comprehensive health care coverage. It's through the ACA exchange that my own family and I get our health care, and so many others in Delaware have had a chance to get access to health care. The 190,000 people in my little state of 900,000 people who have pre-existing conditions no longer had to worry about being denied coverage, and lifetime caps were a thing of the past. This matters. It saved lives. Just listen briefly, if you would, to the story of Nicole from my little hometown of Hockessin, Delaware, a small farming town of just a few thousand people. Nicole's 3-year-old daughter was born with cystic fibrosis, a horrible disease that robs children, people, of the ability to breathe. Nicole's 3-year-old daughter with cystic fibrosis spent at least an hour a day getting breathing treatments from her mother and $5,000 a month getting her medications. Not cheap. And Nicole was confident that without the ACA, she would have exceeded her annual caps and her medical expenses well before the end of the year. Nicole, in reaching out to me, made it clear, without the consumer protections of the Affordable Care Act, she would have had one of three choices: hope she qualified for Medicaid, unlikely due to her income, go into debt to pay for her daughter's treatment, or stop giving her daughter some of the medication she depended on to save her life. All that's assuming that her daughter's cystic fibrosis wasn't considered a pre-existing condition, preventing her from getting any insurance at all. Because of that circumstance, Nicole's story exemplifies the life-changing gains and positive trends the ACA provided. Unfortunately, there were some other challenges as well, which I'll summarize quickly, that have developed over time. Let me transition to where we are today, forgive me. Today, we're in a place where just a year ago, consistent, repeated efforts after the 2016 election by Republicans in Congress to repeal, but without a plan to replace the ACA, resulted in a place where, as my colleague from Connecticut has laid out, the Trump administration has done its best to roll back these ways in which progress was made to extend quality, affordable health care to more Americans. After a number of efforts to repeal the law failed last year, thanks to the American people who stood up and had their voices heard, the administration has decided to take a different approach, a slow and steady unraveling and undermining of the protections that made the ACA work. It started with a decision to stop cost-sharing reduction payments, which help working families afford their premiums and access care. It continued when they changed the rules and encouraged people to sign up for plans that didn't have all the benefits and consumer protections of the ACA, really junk plans, which made possible bringing back discrimination against women and those with pre-existing conditions. And it culminated last month with something that was done in a fly-by-night way and may not have been visible at all to my constituents and viewers, a decision to no longer defend the core components of the ACA in court, including protections for those with pre-existing conditions, in a lawsuit brought by 20 state attorneys general from states that overwhelmingly opposed the ACA. This decision was so shocking. 3 career Justice Department attorneys withdrew from the case, and one with over 20 years' experience resigned from his job. Make no mistake, this was the administration sabotaging the ACA and our healthcare system. President Trump even admitted at a campaign event just cited by my colleague from Connecticut that he had gutted the ACA. This may resonate with the president's base. It may resonate with people he hopes will vote him back into office in the future election. But for millions of families across the country and in my home state, losing protections against pre-existing condition discrimination is a death sentence. It would be devastating for Nicole and her daughter, who I described before. It would be devastating for Kim from my hometown of residence, Wilmington, a thyroid cancer survivor now able to get insurance because her cancer isn't considered a pre-existing condition under the Affordable Care Act. She is not subject to pre-existing condition discrimination. In my small state of Delaware, gutting protections for pre-existing conditions would leave 1 in 5 at risk of skyrocketing health insurance costs or losing coverage altogether. This lawsuit impacts every corner of America's healthcare system, and that our administration is not defending the law of the land is a shocking development. It impacts not just those who get their health care through the ACA exchanges. It would impact 150 million Americans who get their health insurance through their employer, because it would eliminate protections against lifetime and annual limits on care. It would impact seniors on Medicare, who would see increased prescription drug costs. It would impact Americans who depend on free preventive services, cancer screenings, and flu shots, because those policies, components of the ACA, would be eliminated. And it impacts young people who would lose the right to stay on their parents' health insurance until age 26. These are just a few of the devastating impacts if the Texas v. U.S. lawsuit is successful in ripping out what is left of the protections of the ACA. It would have a real and tangible impact on families in my state of Delaware and across our country. That's why I am glad to support a resolution proposed by my colleagues, Senators Manchin, Casey, McCaskill, and others, to defend the constitutionality of pre-existing condition protections in our healthcare system. This is critical to the well-being, to the health of the families we represent. My Democratic colleagues and I know that the ACA was not perfect when passed. I have heard from small business owners in my home state about some of the limitations and the increases in costs and the ways in which they wish we'd had a more robust tax credit for small business, ways that they'd wish we'd worked together to perfect the ACA. That's why I came to the floor time and again in my first 4 years here, seeking colleagues across the aisle willing to work with us to make the Affordable Care Act better. Instead of working to tear down the ACA, we should have been working to address challenges with affordability and coverage, increasing tax credits for small businesses, and making it stronger and more sustainable. Instead of sabotaging the care millions of Americans have depended on, we should have ensured there was more competition in the marketplace, especially in small states like my own. I wish we had instead taken a path of pursuing common sense regulatory reforms and cost containment efforts to slow the rate of growth of healthcare costs. It is not too late for that. It is still not impossible that we could set aside the divisive partisan rhetoric and that this administration will abandon its underhanded attempts to sabotage this healthcare law and instead focus on pursuing constructive and bipartisan fixes. The bottom line is the Affordable Care Act has helped millions of Americans like Nicole and Kim, whose stories I shared with you, live healthier and more secure lives. I am not optimistic, but I insist on remaining hopeful that there is still yet time for us to do our job on a bipartisan basis and secure health care for all of America. But as happened a year ago, roughly next month, the floor of this Senate can still be moved by the voices of Americans who would say to this administration, stop your refusal to defend the ACA. Let's move forward in a positive way together. Thank you, Mr. President.